I'm Nick.
And I'm Will. The two of us co-edited the movie Searching that came out last year. And we're going to talk a little bit about our workflow and our post-process working on that movie. Show of hands, who's seen Searching? Cool.
So for those of you who have not seen the movie, Searching is a missing persons thriller that takes place entirely on computer screens. And that might sound like a really dumb idea for those of you who haven't seen it, so we're going to play a trailer just to kind of give you guys an idea for what the movie's like.
Hey, Dad.
Hey, sweetheart. Where are you?
Study group. I'm gonna go all night.
Oh, one more thing. I want to
Hi,
know
Dad.
about the final you took today.
I'm Margot. I'm 15. Student.
911, what's your emergency?
I'm calling to report a missing person.
Okay, who is this regarding?
My daughter.
I'm the detective assigned to your daughter's case. I need to know how everything unfolded.
Understood.
I think we're gonna go late, like, all night.
1. After a study session, Margot didn't return home.
Margot Kim. School has her marked as absent today.
2. She didn't attend school on Friday.
My daughter is in a lesson with you right now?
Margot canceled her classes 6 months ago.
And 3. She's been transferring funds for the last 6 months. We'll handle the ground investigation, but as a parent, you can help us with who your daughter talks to. Is that something you can do?
Yes. Do you mind answering some questions for me to help?
Did see her eat lunch alone.
On Thursday?
Every day.
You don't think she's involved with anything serious?
I know my daughter.
We're not really that close.
She has friends, right?
Kind of.
Why did you invite her to study group?
I'm trying to get into Berkeley next year.
When was the last time you saw her? She did not run away.
Local team has been missing since last Thursday.
She made a transaction of $2,500. I know my daughter. Where were you the night my daughter went missing? I know my daughter.
Look into her behavior also.
She gets a fake ID. I know my daughter. This is her keychain.
She was my best friend. You broke his jaw.
I know my daughter.
I'm trying to help you find my daughter.
I didn't know her. I didn't know my daughter.
So that gives you a rough idea of what the movie's about. Nothing you saw there was screen recorded, even though the whole movie takes place on computer screens. It was all made in Adobe through Premiere, Illustrator, and After Effects, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But first, a little bit about how each of us got involved on the project. Nick and I both went to USC, but didn't meet till afterward. But I met there the director of this movie, Anish, and helped him edit a spec Google Glass spot. And then he got a job at Google off that. I went into ads for a while. And then 2 years later, he came back with this idea for a movie that takes place all on computer screens. I was a little bit skeptical, but he sold me on how we could pull it off in a unique and novel way. And then we decided it was way too big for one editor to handle.
So I went to school with Anish, and then he went off to Google. I cut a bunch of trailers and then started doing indie features. When Anish came back from Google, back from New York, he hit me up and was like, hey, we're about to make this movie. And then Will and I, who had never met before, met up, and within a couple weeks, we were working on this thing. So it happened rather quickly. So like Will said, both of us at the beginning, probably like most of you, were extremely skeptical of the concept. It was kind of like, okay, a movie that takes place entirely on computer screens, like how can this be cinematic? How can this be engaging? But Anish really pitched it to us, and his vision for this was that we were going to try to make something that we hadn't seen before. Unfriended was a big movie that came out that took place entirely in a wide. There's Noah. There's a really good Modern Family episode. But we still hadn't seen anything that was truly cinematic in the way that we wanted to tell the story.
So yeah, we wanted to show a computer in a movie in a way you've never seen one before, but we didn't have to start from scratch to do that because we've been making movies for about 100 years, and there's lots of conventions we can just take and try and repurpose for this format to try and make what could be a gimmick into something pretty entertaining. So we'll go over sort of a few examples of tropes or really basic ideas you see in movies that we hadn't yet seen done on computer screens, and then B, we'll go over our workflow and how we built that to optimize it for a really unusual type of project.
So the first thing that we're going to talk about in terms of conventions that we borrowed is the shot reverse. So this is something that I think everyone is at least vaguely familiar with. It's this very basic concept of you show one character, you show the other in a conversation. Now this might seem super obvious, but we hadn't seen a screen movie that had done anything like this. Modern Family, like I said, followed the mouse everywhere. There's a really good short film called Noah. So just starting from the basics, we were skeptical that we could even cut in a two-dimensional plane, show a character talking and then cut in and show another character talking. So to give you a little bit of an example of what this concept looked like in searching, here's a scene where David is interrogating all of Margot's friends, trying to find out where she is.
Well, the study group only went till 9.
No, she said it was going all night.
No, she definitely left at 9. Maybe even earlier.
Did she say where she was going?
Not really.
How'd she look? Was she worried? Did she look scared? Was she talking?
Honestly, I don't know. We're not really that close.
Why did you invite her to study group?
I'm trying to get into Berkeley next year.
So the idea here is that that when you're watching the movie, you're not realizing that there's anything different. You're almost forgetting that you're watching a screen movie because we're falling back on something that you see in any other movie, and hopefully it feels familiar and cinematic in the way that normal movies feel like.
So another thing we wanted to do was make the mouse into a character. So I'm going to show you an example of kind of a detective movie trope that we stole, but that rather than showing it through an actor performing, which is what you usually do, we tried to convey it all through the motion of a mouse. So here's a little clip of Humphrey Bogart from the movie The Big Sleep making a discovery. We never referenced any movies directly. These are just examples of things we all had in our minds talking to each other. So he walks to this, notices the flash bulb, and then in kind of a movie logic way that draws his attention to this this statue that happens to be on the table.
And I think the nice thing about his performance is he notices something, there's a beat, and then he walks to it, right?
Yeah,
Which is telling you he gets an idea.
So we were working on this one scene in our cut that it wasn't really playing for some reason, and our producer, Sevohanian, came in and basically told Nick and I, can we do kind of the thing where the detective's about to give up, but then while they're turning off the light, they notice a drop of blood on the light switch, and then they trace it along the wall to the crime scene, but do it all with the mouse. So we tried to do that in a little scene of David Kim closing out Chrome, but then noticing something in his daughter's history.
Did not run away.
So he passes it, then comes up. And I know this might seem almost like painfully basic, but we had not seen anybody attempt something in this way yet, where rather than showing really what it would actually look like if you were on a computer, we pushed it a little less toward the realism side and a little more toward the kind of movie language you're familiar with seeing on screen, to kind of like elevate it to what you're used to watching in a film.
So the last example we're going to show you before we move on to the actual workflow portion is from The Truman Show. So I'm sorry if we're about to spoil The Truman Show for anyone, but here is a clip, and we'll talk about what trope we're seeing here.
To the whole world.
Okay, so this is probably something that we're all vaguely familiar with, and it's what we're calling the world tuning in trope. So it's this idea that at a movie, towards the end, everybody, maybe people you've seen before in the movie, are gathering around bars, and they're gathering around their living room TV. Everyone's tuning in to watch some climactic piece of action, right? And so when we were working on the ending of Searching, we were trying to figure out a way to punch it up and scale it up and make it feel dramatic and cinematic. Because part of the limitations of a screen movie, it's all confined to this screen. So we were asking ourselves, what does this type of sequence look like on a screen? And this is what we came up with.
And there she is. We are getting a closer look now as two rescue responders are pulling up what appears to be Margot Kim in a body basket to the top of this ravine here.
Again, we just want to warn our viewers that we do not know what state she's in as we get a look at Margot's father there, but they are making their way up to the top.
And it looks like responders have gotten her up. Again, no word yet as to her status.
And there you can see her father, as it appears that Search and Rescue is now preparing to lift Margot's body basket onto a stretcher they just prepared.
Again, this is live footage here as Margot Kim, who has been missing for the last week, is now...
So you can see here, we're not showing all these different people watching, but by cutting to different players and showing comments and reactions coming in, we're implying different people watching these streams. And it's all these different, it's BuzzFeed and it's CNN, it's all this stuff. And with the reactions, there's all this engagement online. And so that's just three of many examples of things that we borrowed from existing film language and just kind of repurposed and tried to reimagine what does this look like on a two-dimensional screen.
So on to workflow. This was a very, very small movie. We didn't have much money, many people. So what we did was just prioritize having as much time as possible to make these discoveries like the things we just showed you. We had to figure out a way to pull this off with relatively limited resources. So we'll break down how we did our workflow in 3 stages. First, an animatic, where we mocked up all of the movie over the course of 7 weeks before even shooting. Second, the edit, which was where we cut in the live action, did test screenings, got feedback, the most conventional part of the process. And then last, our graphics phase, where we did final up-resing of everything and prepared it for the world to see. So, first off, creating the animatic. This movie required a lot more prep before you could just run into a live-action shoot, because it would be hard to communicate to department heads what we were even trying to accomplish. So Nick and I sat down 7 weeks before production began and built a full-on animatic of the movie using our director's photos of him and recordings of his voice. The first thing we did was, this was before team projects existed in Adobe, so we had to make sure we weren't stepping on each other's sequences while we were working. We divided the whole film up into 26 sections and made sure each of us was only working one at a time.
So this was like Will said, an extremely small operation. All we really knew is we wanted to make an emotional movie, a cinematic movie, but we didn't yet have John Cho. We didn't have Sony. It was just 5 people in a small room. This was my editing station. That was Will's. We were connected by a little door that we could open and close if we annoyed each other too much. And basically, those first couple weeks were pretty unusual, because as an editor, you very rarely come into an edit with a blank timeline and 0 assets. There was nothing that we had other than a scriptment that said, things like a barrage of images flashes across the screen. And so, it was your job when you came into the office that day to figure out what does that look like. So we started by taking just screenshots, taking screen recordings, all stuff we knew we were going to replace later, just moving as quickly as possible so that we could make that 7-week deadline. We didn't really have much time. So then when we put all that stuff into there, it looked something like this.
So that is an actual still from our first animatic, and that guy you see 3 times is our director, Anish. It was all pictures of his face miming the character's emotions and recordings of his voice. During this whole process, we were also rewriting the script as we made discoveries. based on what worked or didn't work in the animatic. We were kind of willing to try any idea once, no matter how crazy. And as production came closer, we also used Frame.io a lot to kind of make sure Anish, even when he wasn't in the office, could review our cuts and send us notes. So I'm going to show you a short clip of what this first animatic looked like. This is a couple minutes of it. It's honestly not that good, but this is an example of how we learned something from making this. This is the scene where we first introduce David and Margot and their relationship. So before you guys leave because of how boring it is, so this was our first attempt. We first introduced them through a text conversation, and pretty quickly we all realized that not only is this bad design, it isn't drawing your eye to where you need to be to see the text you need to see, but it's just not good storytelling because you need to see the characters' faces before you can really become emotionally invested in them and what's going to happen later in the movie. So based on this scene, us as a team were all able to, before physical production even began, write a face-to-face FaceTime scene that was then just shot like any other scene. And even though this was really rough, we were able to show it to the crew before we began shooting, so they understood a little bit of what the goal was, because as a DP, you say, this movie would be a very vague thing to approach.
All right, so the next phase we're going to talk about is the editing phase, which started 7 weeks after we were brought on. And basically that coincided with physical production. So by this point, we had the bare bones skeletal structure of what we were trying to make with the animatic. And then it was just a matter of taking the assets they were shooting, John Cho, Deborah Messing talking, and putting those into the timeline, replacing all of those pictures of Anish's face and his voice with those live action assets. And while we were doing this, we were still very much experimenting. Nothing was locked. We were still combining scenes and trying to develop a sense for the rules of and the different techniques we would be using. So here is a screenshot of our actual Premiere project. And the first thing you'll notice here is that this is comprised almost entirely of nests. And that was true for the entire movie. So basically, the way that we went about compiling this in Premiere was we would first start with a wide, a 16:9 version of the desktop. We would production design it with different windows, different thumbnails, and then we would do like rough blocking with the mouse. And then we would nest all of that and then put cuts where we'd want cuts and shoot it digitally by just keyframing position data. So it was very, very crude, and it was honestly a real headache because anytime we had to make edits, we would have to go in, adjust everything within the nest, pop out, adjust those. So there was a lot of mental math and a lot of organization required. If you stepped into one of these nests, you'd see something that looked roughly like this. So it was just a bunch of layers, and you can see all the pink clips are PNGs. So the majority of our project was actually comprised with just still images. So a button state, if the mouse hovered over a button, it might be a different picture. The cerulean clips are live action videos, so we actually had relatively few compared to the still images. And then the Mango ones are frame-held videos, which we used a lot. And then if you were to want to unpack our entire project out of its nests, you'd get something that looks like this, which is the entire timeline, unnested.
Yeah. Another important part of the edit that I think we should cover is we did a lot of very small, contained, but intensive test screenings with sort of trusted friends and other filmmakers. This is a photo of one just in a little living room we had. What this allowed us to do, having such focused test screenings, was really poll people individually and specifically about whether they understood what we were doing, whether that be a certain edit or whether a certain line of text was big enough to read. And we could go through the whole film beat by beat and make sure it was all working. And overwhelmingly what we found out was when we thought we were being too crazy, we weren't being crazy enough. And we really learned that people are used to computers and know how to look at a computer. And it really, so doing these screenings really emboldened us to just approach it with as much novelty as possible. Once we did these test screenings, added in the live action, edited for a period of several months, this is what that first Margot and David introduction scene began to look like. You can see it's all still blurry, but the composition and the timing is what you see in the final film.
Hey, Dad.
Hey, sweetheart. How's it going?
Good.
And from here, they go on to have the FaceTime conversation we talked about. So a lot of these changes came from the fact that by doing the previs, we were able to recognize a problem early, but lots of stuff was discovered in the edit, like that tilt-up shot you see to David. So once we had locked everything, we were ready to move on into the last part of the process.
Which was graphics, which was by far the chillest and most fun part of the process. So this basically, once we were locked, it was then just a matter of making it look good, right? So the way we started, every section, there were 26 sections. Every section had its own After Effects project, right? So what we would do is we'd highlight the nests in Premiere and dynamic link them over to After Effects. So this is the After Effects project for the clip you just watched. And then you can see all the individual cuts. This is the uppermost layer of our After Effects project. And basically, the reason why we had to do this is we're punching in so much on little icons that we couldn't just screen record. We couldn't possibly screen record at high enough resolution. So what we had to do was replace all of those temp PNGs and screen records that you saw earlier in our Premiere project with AI files. So 100% of this movie is all just individual AI files that we painstakingly just recreated over the course of the edit and then over the course of this process. So if you were to step into one of these comps, you'd see something that looks like this. As you can see, there are hundreds of layers. All these correspond to basically different drop shadow states, different button states, different mouse states, that sort of thing. And honestly, this was one of the most gratifying parts of the process because as soon as we brought it into After Effects, After Effects has continuous raster. So when we had all those AI files in there, we were just able to turn on continuous raster, and all of a sudden, that clip that you saw, which was really blurry, just became nice and crisp, and we could punch in all we wanted. We could get really tight on icons, and they'd stay really nice and crisp.
Yeah. So to the Illustrator a little bit more, we definitely had some help from a company called Neon Robotic that helped us create basically full vector files of everything from a Finder window like this to Google Chrome to the dock, which we could then customize for each scene. So what you see here is a screenshot of us working on Adobe Illustrator to production design, basically, this Finder window. Every single photo, every line of copy, every headline you see in the movie had to be replaced with something we had cleared. I would say both of our entire camera rolls on our phone are seen somewhere in this movie. But we definitely use that as an opportunity to have some fun. Like if you read the little news ticker here, I stuck that into the cut one time after one of our producers got mad at me. He spotted it in the next screen. It got into the movie and he never found out about it.
Another nice Easter egg Sev hit is some alien-like ongoing sub-story.
Everywhere, really.
Yeah.
Some of you guys have seen the alien
Yeah, if
thing.
anyone's seen it, you'll probably know what we're talking about. So there are a lot of fun Easter eggs, and also just character details that were fun to inject in there. Because the idea was we wanted to make it pause-proof as much as we could. So if someone paused, there'd be a lot of information to see.
Yeah. And then, so after we were done with all of the graphics, we sent it to our render farm, which was a little computer in our basement/server room.
Which was totally not.
That thing was a
cool
champ,
with
though.
It was against fire code.
Yeah, they shut us down. So if you took that whole process from the animatic through the edit, through the graphics, which took us about 1.5 years total, and sped it up to fit inside of a minute, this is about what it would look like. So yeah, we used Adobe in some small capacity on this movie. Really though, I think this film was made possible by technology like this and like Creative Cloud, because if we hadn't had something that could integrate Premiere, Photoshop, Illustrator, and After Effects all under one workflow, this would have been much, much harder to pull off.
So that is a very, very brief overview of our workflow. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to come up to us. We're happy to answer any questions.
We'll be chilling over here.
Yeah. But just kind of take a step back, I guess. Obviously, this genre is relatively new, and we're by no means like an expert on the direction of where it's going. But I do think it's safe to say that as devices, as computers, become more and more a part of our daily lives, that they're going to play a much bigger role in films going forward, and that includes, both being used as a plot device, but also just being portrayed authentically, which is, I think, something that we haven't seen enough of yet, and I think film is finally kind of catching up to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Spider-Man.